The night was quieter than usual in Red Hall, and when I say silence, it's not the kind of peace. It's the kind that weighs on your bones, that makes the wind stop blowing, as if even it were afraid to cross the streets. I was alone in my office, cleaning the barrel of my revolver, when I heard footsteps. They weren't ordinary footsteps. They were quick, nervous, as if each beat against the floor was a race against something invisible. I looked up and saw the door burst open. A man enters. No, Invideth room. The first thing I noticed was the smeller mixture of old dust, cold sweat, iron, and blood. He was covered in dust, as if he'd been riding all night without stopping. But what caught my attention most were his eyes. They were like broken windows, revealing a desperation I'd never seen in anyone. He slammed the door behind him, as if to stop something from entering. "Sheriff, for God's sake, hang me." His voice was hoarse, shaky, and that was the first thing that made me freeze. "What?" I asked, thinking I had heard wrong. "Now, before midnight." He looked at the clock on the wall and took a step towards me. "Please hang me before it's too late." There was no drunkenness in his eyes, no smell of whiskey on his breath. He was sober and terrified. "Sit down," I said, trying to understand. But he didn't move. He looked out the window, as if expecting to see something outside. And at that moment, I felt it too. That still air got colder, much colder. He began to pace, running his hands through his disheveled hair. "You don't understand, Sheriff," his voice cracked. "If I'm alive when the clock strikes midnight, I won't be here anymore. At least, I won't be here anymore. EU. My instincts told me to put that man in the cell and call the town doctor. But there was something wrong, something about the way his shadow fell on the ground. It seemed longer than it should have, more alive than he was. And every now and then, she would move for Cher. With each word, I realized it wasn't just fear. It was certainty, certainty that something was coming to get him. And at that moment, I realized that somehow this story was not going to end well. I am Elias Blackthorne, last Sheriff of Red Hollow. I say last because, after me, no one else wanted to wear that brass star. Maybe out of fear, or because they already knew this city was no place for the living. I spent 20 years serving and protecting the people here. I faced outlaws, bounty hunters, and roadside ambushes, but nothing, absolutely nothing prepared me for that night. The man before me seemed to be carrying an invisible weight. Sweat ran down his face, even with the chilly air that filled the room. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. It was as if he were trying to keep his body under control, as if something was pulling at his muscles from within. "Listen to me, Sheriff," he said, his voice almost breaking. "I'm not a murderer. I'm not a bandit. But if you don't hang me now, when the clock strikes midnight, something will come out of me, something that will kill." I looked at the old wall clock. The hands read 11:40-3. We had 17 minutes. And at that moment, I confess that my mind began to weigh the options. I'd seen men mad, drunk, high on opium, But this wasn't one of them. There was no delirium in his eyes. There was truth. A truth so raw it chilled my spine. He walked over to my desk and rested his hands on it, panting. "Have you ever seen the desert at night, Sheriff? Have you ever heard the wind change direction? For no reason. Have you ever felt the ground breathe beneath your feet?" I remained silent, and he continued. "I saw, and since that night I haven't slept, because in the dark he comes." The man began pacing around the office again, but this time he didn't just seem restless. He seemed to be fighting something that was trying to tear him apart from the inside out. I felt the muscles in my neck contract, as if something were pushing to get out. The distant chapel bell rang 11:50. 10 minutes. That's when I noticed something on his skin. Dark marks that went up his arm, like roots. And as he moved, I heard a low, guttural sound coming from him, but not from his lungs. It was deeper, as if it came from somewhere else. My finger itched to reach for the gun handle, but a part of me knew it was no use. Not against that. I looked into his eyes and said, "Tell me everything, now." He took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "If I tell you, it will be too late. But if you do what I ask, maybe there will still be time to stop me from changing." The clock struck 11:50-1 dot, and at that moment, the wind blew through the window, bringing a smell that did not belong to this world. 11:50-2. The sound of the wind outside grew sharper, as if it were rushing through a narrow space, scraping against the invisible walls of the night. The flame of the lamp flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The man whose name he hadn't yet told me doubled over as if punched in the stomach. His breathing became ragged. The veins in his arms and neck became even, darker, almost black, and seemed to pulse like snakes beneath his skin. "It's coming," he murmured, spitting the words out as if they burned in his mouth. "Don't let me wake up when it happens." The sound that came from him next didn't sound human. It was a deep crack, like bones breaking from within, followed by a low, muffled rumble that reverberated across the wooden floor. My instincts screamed to get out of there, but my job as sheriff has always been to protect Heaven. If, at that moment, I wasn't sure if I was protecting his town, or he the town. 11:50-4. The old wall clock began to make a strange sound. It no longer ticked like it always did. Now, each second seemed to carry a wet echo, as if the hands were cutting through flesh instead of air. I looked at the man and realized something that made my stomach turn. His shadow, cast on the floor by the lamp, was no longer with him. While he trembled, hunched over, the shadow was standing erect, staring directly at me. He lifted his head, and for a moment, his eyes weren't eyes anymore. They were two black spheres, shining with a reflection that didn't come from the light. In the room, Sheriff, the voice was both his and not. "If you don't do this, it won't just be red hollow that pays." 11:50-6. The smell worsened. It wasn't sweat, it wasn't blood. It was a stale, damp odor, like the disturbed earth of a forgotten grave. I began to taste iron in my mouth. The man fell to his knees, his hands digging their nails into the floor. The wood began to creak as if it were alive, and I noticed small cracks forming where he touched. I glanced at the hanging rope hanging on my office wall. It was old, last used over 6 years ago. It wasn't something I expected to need so soon, and certainly not like this. 1150-8. He looked up at me and smiled, but the smile wasn't his, and it was at that moment that I realized maybe hanging that man wasn't to kill him. Maybe it was to prevent something inside him from being born. Midnight. The sound of the clock's final strike was no ordinary dong. It was deeper, heavier, and ended with a wet snap, as if time had broken its teeth biting into that hour. The man, or whatever he was, let out a scream that made the air vibrate in my chest. It wasn't just a sound. It was as if something invisible had passed through the room, piercing my ribs. The lamp went out on its own, but the room wasn't completely dark. There was a light coming from it, not a clean light, but a sickly, greenish glow that seemed to pulse beneath the skin. He began to grow, not in height, but in presence. It was as if the air around him shrank, as if the room were too small to hold the thing. The cracks in the floor opened wider, and I could see fingers, human fingers, stirring beneath the boards, trying to get out. It's too late. The voice now came from every corner of the room, even though his mouth was closed. The shadow that had once imitated him began to distort. First, it elongated, climbing the wall as if scaling it to escape. Then, it projected itself onto the ceiling, taking shaped long horns, skeletal fingers, a thin, hunched body. I smelled it, strong, suffocating, damp earth mixed with sulfur. This wasn't just a man possessed. No, something was being born within him, and his body was just the cocoon. The skin on his neck stretched tight like wet leather, and I could eerily hear something scratching inside, trying to get out. His eyes, once black, now burned with a pulsing red glow, and when he opened his mouth, I saw more eyes inside, blinking eyes. The old clock struck once more. 13 chimes. 13. No watch should do that. Sheriff, his voice whispered inside my skull. If you don't pull the cord now, you'll watch the world end from your own office window. My body acted before my mind could decide. I grabbed the rope, my hands trembling, but before I could take the first step, something grabbed my ankle. I looked down and saw a hand emerging from its shadow on the ground. I grabbed the knot, hooked the end around the thickest beam, and began to noose. He looked at me and smiled, and somehow that smile made me feel like I was about to strangle not a man, but the very thing holding something far worse back. And when I put the rope around his neck, I realized it wasn't him breathing anymore. Bith thing, and she breathed in my place. The rope felt heavier than it should have, as if every fiber were weighed down with centuries of damnation. The manor, rather, the thing inside him stood completely still, watching me. Only his eyes moved, but they didn't blink. They were red headlights burning in the dim light. I slipped the noose around his neck and the moment the rope touched my skin, I felt a chill so strong it felt like my own veins were trying to escape. The smell of sulfur intensified, now mixed with that of hot blood. "You don't understand, Sheriff." His voice now sounded like a chorus of several mouths speaking at once, some whispering, some shouting. "If I die now, you'll have to be careful what leaves here." The floor creaked. The hands reaching from beneath the boards began to pull hard, trying to lift themselves up. I saw faces, deformed faces, some without eyes, others with their mouths sewn shut, and they were all screaming. No, they were begging, but not for me. They were begging the thing not to leave. I pulled on the rope. He staggered forward, as if accepting his fate. But as I lifted him to hang him from the beam, the world around him shook. It wasn't an earthquake. It was as if the room were breathing walls, inflating and deflating, like giant lungs. Suddenly, his shadow detached itself from his body. It grew taller and stared at me. Now I could see it clearly. Long horns, an elongated face with rows of teeth sharpening themselves as if they were alive. It spoke to me, but without sound. The message came straight to my mind. "You're not strong enough." I felt my arms grow heavy. The rope began to slip from my hands as if it were alive, writhing like a snake. And when I looked up, the beam where I intended to hang him was different, soaked as if made of flesh. The man, still with the noose around his neck, smiled. "Now you're on my time, Sheriff. Here, midnight never ends." I tried to pull again, but something held me back. Hands, many, gripping my shirt, my shoulders, my wrists. Faces appeared in the darkness, too close to my ear, whispering words I couldn't understand, but which burned into my skin like a hot iron. And in the midst of that confusion, I realized the rope was no longer around his neck. It was around mine hands, pulled me back as the rope tightened around my neck. I felt the knot sliding across my skin as if it had a life of its own, adjusting itself, finding the perfect position to cut off my breath. The man, or whatever was using his body, didn't move. He just watched me, with that smile meant to say, "You've already lost." The room was darker, but not because the light had dimmed, but because the shadows had grown denser, as if they were taking up real space, weighing down the air. I tried to scream, but my voice came out muffled, as if my mouth were full of dirt. I saw the wall clock, and the second hand was spinning backward. No, not only that, it was speeding up. With each revolution, a dry, cracking sound echoed, like a bone breaking. The figures holding me began to whisper, and I realized they were repeating the same phrase, in sync. Midnight is not for everyone. Midnight is not for everyone. I felt the floor give way. My boots scraped against the wood as I tried to steady myself, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. And just as I nearly fell into the hole that was forming, the thing spoke. "Now you understand. I asked to die before midnight because here there is no after." Darkness swallowed me. There was no falling, no ground, just the sensation of being suspended in midair. the noose tightening ever tighter. And in the background, I could hear a distant chorus calling my name, Elijah, Elijah, Elijah. It was the first time since I died that I felt truly afraid. And if you want to know what happened next, if I manage to get out, or if I'm still trapped, so do this. Don't leave and find out what happened that night. His face was inches from mine. There was no human warmth, only a cold breath, like that of a corpse fresh from the grave. His eyes, God, were no longer human. They were deep, bottomless pits where living shadows swirled, writhing like worms in the earth. Now you know what haunts me, he whispered, and each word seemed to scratch at the inside of my head. If you don't hang me before midnight, it will come for you too. I tried to esquo, but my throat burned, and I realized the answer didn't matter, because in that instant I felt the presence. You didn't need to see it. It was behind me, so close I could hear something moving inside its bones, or chains, or both. The rope creaked in the silence. Sheriff, he continued, if you don't, you'll be next, and you'll beg, just like I begged. Then everything went dark, a thick, heavy darkness that not even the memory of light could penetrate, and a slow, drawn-out laugh that came neither from him nor from me. I woke up, at least I think I woke up, but since then, every watch I see has a midnight, and now she's closer. If I stop counting, the thing comes. If you can still hear me, don't waste your time. Click on the next video now and find out what happens when something worse than the rope comes for you. But be careful if you stop in the middle.